Part 1. Origins. The origins of the Revolution necessarily lie deep in America's past. A century and a half of dynamic developments in the British continental colonies of the New World had fundamentally transformed inherited European institutions and customary patterns of life, and had left many colonists believing that they were seriously deviating from the cultivated norms of European life. In comparison with prosperous and powerful metropolitan England, America in the middle of the 18th century seemed a primitive, backward place, disordered and turbulent, without a real aristocracy, without magnificent courts or large urban centers, indeed without any of the attributes of the civilized world. Consequently, the colonists repeatedly felt pressed to apologize for the crudity of their society, the insignificance of their art and literature, and the triviality of their affairs. Suddenly, in the 1760s, Great Britain thrust its imperial power into this changing world with a thoroughness that had not been felt in a century, and precipitated a crisis within the loosely organized empire. American resistance turned into rebellion. But as the colonists groped to make sense of the peculiarities of their society, this rebellion became a justification and idealization of American life, as it had gradually and unintentionally developed over the previous century and a half. Instead of being in the backwaters of history, Americans suddenly saw themselves as a new society, ideally equipped for a republican future. In this sense, as John Adams later said, the Revolution was effected before the war commenced. It was a change in the minds and hearts of the people. But this change was not the whole American Revolution. The Revolution was not simply an intellectual endorsement of a previously existing social reality. It was also an integral part of the great transforming process that carried America into the liberal democratic society of the modern world. Although colonial America was already a different place from Europe in 1760, it still retained, along with powdered wigs and knee breeches, many traditional habits of monarchical behavior and dependent social relationships. The Revolution shattered what remained of these traditional patterns of life, and prepared the way for the more fluid, bustling, individualistic world that followed. The changes were remarkable, and they gave the American people as grand a vision of their future as any people have ever had. Americans saw their new nation not only leading a world revolution on behalf of republicanism and liberty, but also becoming the place where the best of all the arts and sciences would flourish. What began as a colonial rebellion on the very edges of the civilized world was transformed into an earth-shaking event, an event that promised, as one clergyman declared, to create out of the perishing world a new world, a young world, a world of countless millions, all in the fair bloom of piety. The growth and movement of population. In 1763, Great Britain straddled the world with the greatest and richest empire since the fall of Rome. From India to the Mississippi River, its armies and navies had been victorious. The Peace of Paris that concluded the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War as the Americans called it, gave Britain undisputed dominance over the eastern half of North America. From the defeated powers, France and Spain, Britain acquired huge chunks of territory in the New World, all of Canada, East and West Florida, and millions of fertile acres between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. France turned over to Spain the territory of Louisiana, in compensation for Spain's loss of Florida. And thus this most fearsome of Britain's enemies removed itself altogether from the North American continent. Yet at the moment of Britain's supremacy, there were powerful forces at work that would soon, almost overnight, change everything. In the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, British officials found themselves having to make long-postponed decisions concerning the colonies that would set in motion a chain of events that ultimately shattered the empire. Ever since the formation of the British Empire in the late 17th century, royal officials and bureaucrats had been interested in reforming the ramshackle imperial structure and in expanding royal authority over the American colonists. But most of their schemes had been blocked by English ministries more concerned with the patronage of English politics than with colonial reform. Under such circumstances, the empire had been allowed to grow haphazardly, without much control from London. People from different places in Europe had been allowed to settle in the colonies, and land had been given out freely. Although few imperial officials had ever doubted that the colonies were supposed to be inferior to the mother country and dependent on it, in fact the empire had not worked that way. The relationship that had developed reflected the irrational and inefficient nature of the imperial system, the variety of offices, the diffusion of power, and the looseness of organization. Even in trade regulation, which was the empire's main business, inefficiency, loopholes, and numerous opportunities for corruption prevented the imperial authorities from interfering substantively with the colonists' pursuit of their own economic and social interests. By the middle of the 18th century, however, new circumstances began forcing changes in this irrational but working relationship. The British colonies, there were 22 of them in the Western Hemisphere in 1760, were becoming too important to be treated as casually as the mother country had treated them in the first half of the 18th century. Dynamic developments throughout the greater British world demanded that England pay more attention to its North American colonies. The most basic of these developments were the growth and movement of population. In the middle decades of the 18th century, the number of people throughout the whole English-speaking world, in Britain and the colonies alike, was increasing at unprecedented rates. During the 1740s, the population of England, which had hardly grown at all for half a century, suddenly began to increase. The populations of Ireland and Scotland had been rising steadily since the beginning of the 18th century. The population of the North American colonies was growing even faster, virtually exploding, and had been doing so almost since the beginning of the settlements. Indeed, the North American colonists continued to multiply more rapidly than any other people in the Western world. Between 1750 and 1770, they doubled in number, from 1 million to more than 2 million, and thereby became an even more important part of the British world. In 1700, the American population had been only 1/20th of the British and Irish populations combined. By 1770, it was nearly 1/5, and such far-sighted colonists as Benjamin Franklin were predicting that sooner or later, the center of the British Empire would shift to America. Everywhere, the expanding British population was in motion, moving from village to village and from continent to continent. In Britain, growing numbers of migrants in a few decades created the new industrial cities of Birmingham, Manchester, and Leeds, and made London the largest urban center in the Western world. A steady stream moved from the British Isles across the Atlantic to the New World. The migration of Protestant Irish and Scots that had begun early in the century increased after the 7 Years' War of the 1750s.